What happens when the most beautiful voice in the world sings for an audience that is not of this world? This is not a story about fame. This is a warning about a gift so powerful. It echoes in a realm we were never meant to see. And the one rule she was given was to never look. Have you ever heard a sound that felt like it reached inside your chest and rearranged your very soul? Not just music, not just a pretty melody, but a voice, a force of nature given sound. A voice that could make a king weep on his throne and a poor man feel like one. A voice that didn't just sing about heartbreak. It was a heartbreak. It didn't just describe joy, it was a joy itself. In the crowded coffee houses of Cairo, from radios perched in open windows, that voice was a soundtrack to a million lives. It was a thread that stitched together a whole generation. And that voice belonged to a woman named Amira. To hear Amira sing was to witness magic. When she stepped on the stage, a hush would fall, a respectful, loving, eager silence. The stage lights would find her, and she'd stand there, so humble, so still, a simple scarf draped over her hair. She'd clutch the microphone like it was the hand of an old friend. She'd close her eyes. She'd take a breath that everyone in the audience seemed to take with her. And then she would begin. And oh, what a beginning it was. It wasn't loud. It was deep. It started from a place of profound silence within her and flowed out, filling the hall, wrapping around every single person, making them feel she was singing only to them. She could hold a note for so long, you forget to breathe yourself, just waiting, suspended in that beautiful agony, until she finally released it, and the entire audience would exhale as one, bursting into thunderous, grateful applause. They didn't just throw flowers at her feet. They threw their adoration, their secrets, their hopes. She was more than a singer. She was a healer, a priestess of emotion, and she loved her people as fiercely as they loved her. For her, the connection was everything. The sea of faces, glistening with tears in the dim light, was her fuel, her purpose. She saw the old man smiling through his sadness, the young couple holding hands, the woman closing her eyes and being transported to another memory, another time. That was her real payment. Not the money, that human connection. But fame, real fame, is a strange thing. It builds you a throne, but it also builds walls around you. It attracts light, but it also attracts things that prefer to stay in the shadows. It was at the peak of her career, after a concert that left thousands spellbound, that the stranger came. He arrived at her manager's office as the last of the stage lights were being turned off. There was no fanfare, no announcement. He was just there, a man of impeccable, almost severe elegance. His suit was a dark, charcoal gray, tailored perfection, without a single crease. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, but it was his demeanor that was so unsettling. Her manager, Fuad, a man who was used to dealing with wealthy patrons and pushy producers, later said the man had an aura of absolute calm, a stillness that felt more like a void than peace. He didn't smile. His eyes, a pale, light-flecked brown, didn't dart around the room. They simply rested on you, taking everything in and giving nothing back. But it was silent, profoundly, unnervingly silent. Figures moved in the periphery. Servants, she assumed. They were dressed in simple, elegant robes. Their movements were fluid, graceful, but utterly silent. Their faces were downcast, and when one passed close to her, she saw its eyes were vacant, as if the person behind them was simply not home. They didn't speak. They merely gestured for her to follow, gliding down cavernous hallways. She was led not to a green room, but to a small antechamber directly behind where she would perform. And there it was, the screen. It was a vast expanse of the palest, most delicate ivory silk, stretched taut on a massive frame. It shimmered faintly, as if woven with threads of crystal. Through it, she could just barely make out the shapes of the grand hall beyond, a vast, dark space. Empty, or so it seemed. Her guides, the silent servants, indicated that this was where she would stand. They pointed to a carafe of water, a single glass. Then, without a sound, they melted away into the shadows, leaving her utterly alone. The silence pressed in on her. She could hear her own heart beating, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was all wrong. the luxury, the perfection. It felt like a beautifully crafted trap. She wanted to run, to flee back to the dusty, noisy, warm reality of the city. But it was too late. A sound came from the hall beyond the screen. A soft, collective rustle, like a field of dry grass swaying in a wind she couldn't feel. Then a sense of presence. The vast, empty hall was no longer empty. It was now full. She could feel the weight of hundreds of bodies settling in, the intensity of hundreds of points of attention focusing on the silkscreen that hid her. Her mouth went dry. Her hands trembled. She closed her eyes, trying to find her center, trying to remember who she was. She was Amira, the voice. She was here to sing. That was her truth. That was her weapon against this terrifying unknown. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She nodded to the unseen musician who must have been waiting in the shadows, a lutist provided by the hosts who had not spoken a word to her. The first, lonely note of the oud echoed in the stifling silence. It was a sound of profound longing. Amira clutched the microphone. She thought of her mother's face. She thought of the crowd she loved. She poured every ounce of her fear, her hope, her longing into that first breath. And then she began to sing. The note that left her lips was pure. It was strong. It was vulnerable. It was everything she was. And as it flowed out into the hall, something happened. The rustling stopped. The sense of shifting, of settling, ceased completely. The air itself seemed to grow thick, heavy, charged with an energy she had never felt before. It was as if the entire world had frozen to listen. There was no cough, no whisper, no rustle of clothing. Just a silence so deep and complete, it was louder than any applause. Her voice echoed in that perfect void. It didn't feel like she was singing to an audience. It felt like her voice was being absorbed, consumed. She sang verse after verse, each note hanging in the air, sustained not by acoustics, but by this rapt, terrifying attention. She forgot the rule. She forgot her fear. The artist in her took over, rising to meet this profound, if bizarre, appreciation. She poured her soul into music, her voice gaining power, soaring to melodies she had sung 1,000 times, but which now felt new and strange. She finished the song. The last note faded into nothing, and from the other side of the shimmering silkscreen, there came not the sound of human hands clapping. It was a sigh, a long, collective, shuddering exhalation that didn't sound like it came from human lungs. It was like the wind moving through a forest of glass trees. It was followed by a soft, shimmering sound, like 1,000 tiny bells vibrating in perfect, eerie harmony. In that moment, any illusion that this was a gathering of shy, reclusive humans shattered into a million pieces. Amira stood frozen, her blood running cold. She was not singing for people. She was surrounded, and they were listening. That sound, that beautiful, terrible, unearthly sound, it hung in the air of that grand, cold hall long after the last note of Amira's song had faded. It wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement. A recognition from the darkness that her art had been received, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. Amira stood frozen behind the silk screen, the microphone a cold, dead weight in her sweating hand. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was an expectant silence, a waiting silence. They were waiting for her to continue. From the shadows, the unseen oud player, following some unseen command, began the introduction to the next song. The melody was familiar, one of her most beloved, a song of deep, aching longing. But the notes in this context felt like a trap closing around her. Mechanically, driven by a lifetime of discipline, Amira lifted the microphone to her lips. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. A tremor ran through it, a vibration of pure fear that she had never known before. She, who had commanded the attention of thousands, was now a prisoner to the attention of something else. She sang, but her mind was no longer on the poetry, on the emotion. It was screaming in a silent panic. What are they? The rule echoed in her head, a desperate mantra. Do not look. Do not look. Do not look. But the curiosity was no longer just curiosity. It was a primal need, a survival instinct. To face the unknown, to see the predator in the dark, is less terrifying than imagining it. The human mind cannot long endure a horror it cannot define. It will seek its own destruction for the sake of answers. She tried to focus on the song, on the technical aspects, her breathing, her pitch, but her eyes were drawn to the shimmering veil before her. The silk was so thin, like a mist. Through it, she could see movement, not the clear shapes of people in seats, but a languid, flowing motion, like heat haze rising from desert sand or the distortion of light through a flame. And the smell, that faint scent of ozone and spice, was growing stronger, warmer. Song bled into song. The performance became a surreal blur. She would lose herself for a moment in the familiar comfort of the music, and then a shift in the shadows beyond the screen would jolt her back into heart-pounding terror. The cycle was torture. She was pouring her soul out for a presence that felt ancient, immense, and utterly alien. During a short instrumental passage, she found herself staring at a particular section of the screen, a place where two panels of silk overlapped just slightly, creating a tiny, almost invisible gap, a peephole into the truth. The pull became magnetic, irresistible. Just a glance. The voice in her head reasoned, a voice that now sounded like her own, but twisted by fear. What harm could glance do? They are so enthralled. They won't notice. Maybe they are just different, disfigured. I can handle it. I need to see. I need to know who appreciates my music so deeply. It was the artist's need for connection, the very thing that had defined her life, that finally overrode command, that in the crushing, suffocating weight of the unknown, her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. The oud played on, its mournful notes masking the sound of her shallow, frantic breaths. Slowly, so slowly, she took a half-step forward. The luxurious carpet swallowed any sound. She leaned in, her eye drawn to that tiny sliver of an opening. She brought her face closer to the cool, shimmering silk. The world narrowed to that one point. The music faded into a dull roar in her ears. She closed one eye, and she looked. For a single, horrifying second, her brain refused to process what it was seeing. It was too vast, too wrong. It rejected the information. The grand hall was filled, but not with men and women. The forms were tall, impossibly so, and shimmered with internal light, like heat rising from a scorched road. Their outlines were not solid. They flickered and danced, sometimes coalescing into shapes that were almost human, long, graceful limbs, the suggestion a head, a torso, and then dissolving into something else entirely, something with too many joints, with limbs that tapered into wisps of smoke and light. And their eyes, where faces should have been, there were clusters of light, like smoldering embers fanned by a slow wind. They pulsed in time with the music. They were not watching. They were drinking her voice, her emotion, the very essence of her song. Some had features that flickered into brief, terrifying clarity. The sharp, elegant head of a desert fox, eyes burning with intelligence. The hollow gaze of a bird of prey, beautiful, androgynous faces with eyes that were black, bottomless pits. They swayed, not to the rhythm, but to something beneath it, a current of magic she couldn't perceive. It was a scene of rapture, of terrifying, monstrous appreciation. Her voice, her human art, was a rare delicacy for these things. These jinn, the truth, cold and absolute, stabbed through her mind. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips. It was barely a sound, a sharp intake of breath. But it was enough. As one, every cell of those pulsing, ember-like eyes snapped away from the stage. They turned. They focused on a tiny gap in the silk screen, on her single, terrified eyes staring back at them. The music stopped dead. The oud note was cut off with a discordant twang. The sighing, shimmering appreciation vanished. It was replaced by a silence, so profound it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the hall. It was a silence of outrage, of a sacred rule broken. The pact was shattered. Amira stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of her gown, crashing into the stand holding her water glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound explosively loud in the terrible quiet. Panic, pure undiluted animal panic, seized her. She had to get out. Now. She turned from the screen and fled into the antechamber, but the doorway she'd entered through was gone, or hidden. The walls, which had been adorned with simple tapestries, now seemed to be made of the same shifting, dark glass as the palace's exterior, reflecting her own terrified face back at her from a dozen angles. There were no silent servants to guide her. She was alone in a shifting labyrinth. A low sound began to build from the grand hall behind her. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a hum, a resonant frequency that made the very bones of the palace vibrate. It was the sound of a hive disturbed. She ran, her breath sobbing in her throat. The cold, elegant hallways she'd been led down before now seemed to twist and turn on themselves. A corridor that should have led to the entrance instead ended in a blank, polished wall. The air grew warmer, carrying the sharp, electric tang of a coming storm. She could hear no footsteps behind her, but she could feel them, a presence, vast and angry, flowing to the palace around her, through the walls themselves, seeking her. The beautiful palace was no longer a venue. It was a living, breathing trap, and it was closing in. She rounded a corner in there, and then a long passage. She saw it, the vast, carved main door. It was slightly ajar, and the cool, familiar night air of the desert beckoned like a miracle. With a final, desperate burst of energy, she sprinted for it, her gown tearing on the edge of a table. She didn't care. She burst through the doors, stumbling down the stone steps onto the sand. The black car was still there. The driver was standing by the open back door, his expression as placid and unmoved as ever, as if he'd been expecting her frantic, terrified arrival at that exact moment. She threw herself into the car, scrambling across the seat, pressing herself into the far corner. The driver closed the door with a soft, final thud. As the car pulled away, moving swiftly across the desert, Amira twisted in her seat, pressing her hands against the cold glass of the rear window, looking back at the palace. It stood there, a beautiful, angular nightmare against the starry sky. And then, as she watched, it began to fade, not collapse, not vanish in a puff of smoke. It simply became transparent, like a mirage dissolving in the heat, its lights winking out one by one. Within seconds, there was nothing there, only the empty, dark desert. She turned back around, collapsing into the seat. She was shaking uncontrollably, great, racking shudders that came from the very core of her being. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she couldn't get warm. A coldness had settled deep inside her, a coldness that had nothing to do with the desert night. The driver didn't speak. He didn't look at her in the mirror. He just drove, delivering her back to the world she knew, a world that now felt fragile and thin, like tissue paper over a gaping void. When the car stopped at her home, she stumbled out without a word. She didn't look back. She walked into her house, past the worried questions of her family, and went straight to her room. The sickness began that night. It was not a flu, not a fever any doctor could diagnose. It was a sickness of the spirit. Her body was cold, then burning hot. She would wake from fitful sleep screaming. The image of those pulsing ember eyes burned onto the back of her eyelids. The scent of ozone and spice seemed to have seeped into her clothes, her hair, her skin. Days turned into weeks. Fuad came, full of questions about the money, his face falling when he saw her state. Doctors came, shook their heads, prescribed tonics and rest. They called it nerves, exhaustion, but it was more than that. The core of her was fractured. She would try to hum, to find solace in the thing that had always been her comfort, but her voice would catch in her throat. A tremor of pure, undiluted fear would run through her vocal cords. The memory was a poison in her gift. To sing was to remember. To remember was to feel that terror all over again. The world moved on. The official story became that the great Amira had fallen gravely ill. The whispers, the old folk tales about the singer and the jinn, began to circulate in the coffee houses and the souks, told in hushed, thrilling tones. But for Amira, it wasn't a story. It was her life, her prison. Years passed. She retired from public life completely. The adulation faded. She became a ghost, a legend spoken of in the past tense. She lived a quiet life, tending her garden, surrounded by family who loved her but could never truly understand the darkness that had touched her, The healing, when it came, was slow. It was not a sudden miracle. It was a quiet, stubborn choice made every single day. It was a choice to look at the jasmine flower and see its beauty, not the darkness of the soil it grew from. It was a choice to listen to the wind in the trees and hear a song, not a sigh. She began to understand that what had happened to her was not a punishment. It was a testament. Her gift had been so profound, so pure, that it had transcended the boundary between the human and the unseen. She had not been cursed. She had been witnessed by the most ancient and secretive audiences. The fear slowly transformed into a solemn, awe-filled respect. One evening, many years later, she was sitting in her garden with her young granddaughter on her lap. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Grandmother," the little girl said, her voice soft and trusting, "will you sing for me? Mama says you had the most beautiful voice in the world." Amira's breath caught. The old fear, cold and familiar, rose in her throat. She closed her eyes. She waited for the images to come, the shifting light, the ember eyes. But this time they didn't. This time she didn't see the terror. She saw the rapture. She saw the awe. She saw the beautiful, terrible mystery of it all. She took a breath, a clean breath. She looked down at her granddaughter's hopeful, loving face, a human face, full of light and life. And Amira, the woman who had sung for beings not of this world, began to sing. Her voice was older, weathered. It was not the powerful instrument that had commanded palaces. It was quieter, softer, but it carried a new depth, a depth forged in fear and tempered by time. It was a song of two worlds, of beauty and terror, of the known and the unknown. She sang a lullaby, a simple, ancient melody about the moon watching over the dreams of children. When she finished, the last note faded into the twilight. There was no shimmering sigh, no unearthly applause. There was only a moment of perfect, peaceful quiet. And then her granddaughter sighed a small, happy human sigh and snuggled closer. A single tear rolled down Amira's cheek, catching the last of the sunset light. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of acceptance. She had faced the ultimate audience. She had stared into the heart of the unknown, and she had survived. Her music and her spirit had been, and always would be, stronger than the fear. The story ends not with a scream, but with a whisper of melody on the evening breeze. A legacy that forever acknowledges the darkness, but always, always chooses to sing of the light.